THE Vincent Russo arrived at the Boston docks every morning at 5:45. Not because he had to. Not because the logistics required it. He arrived because the hour before dawn was the only time the waterfront operated at something close to full honesty. The longshoremen were tired and cold and too deep in their routines to put on a performance. The crew chiefs logged the actual numbers before the day shift arrived with its layer of civilian oversight. The customs liaison who took Vincent's monthly envelope made his rounds before the federal inspector came on at 7. Everything worked in that hour. Everything was visible. Vincent had run his end of the Boston waterfront for 11 years. He did not run it with violence, or not primarily with violence. He ran it with debt. Every dock foreman, every union steward, every mid-level city official who wanted a piece of the freight business had taken money from Vincent at some point. And the taking created an obligation that Vincent tracked with the same precision a legitimate bank applied to a mortgage. He did not forget amounts. He did not forget terms. He did not forget the faces of men who had looked him in the eye when they shook his hand. His operation was structured around 3 legitimate businesses. A freight forwarding company called Coastal Logistics occupied a clean office building near the waterfront. A commercial property holding company named Harbor Properties LLC held leases on 11 warehouses in South Boston and Charlestown. A staffing agency called Atlantic Shore Placement provided contract workers to the docks, to restaurants, to construction sites. All 3 companies were audited annually by an accounting firm whose senior partner had borrowed $200,000 from Vincent's organization 5 years ago and had never missed his monthly arrangement since. Through these 3 companies, Vincent moved money, moved goods, and maintained his access to the port infrastructure without ever appearing on a criminal indictment. His name had appeared on law enforcement radar 3 times over 11 years. Each time, the investigation dissolved within 4 months. Not because Vincent had corrupted specific investigators, though he had done that where necessary, but because the paper trail always led to a licensed business, a legitimate transaction, and a clean tax return. The morning of November 3rd, Vincent stood in a warehouse on Dry Dock Avenue and watched 2 men zip a body bag around the remains of a crew boss named Dennis Coyle. Coyle had been managing a small independent extortion ring operating on the north end of the docks, which would not have been a problem under normal circumstances. Independent operations existed at the margins of every waterfront organization. Vincent tolerated them as a matter of practical policy, so long as they paid their percentage, and did not conflict with his primary commercial interests. Coyle had been missing his percentage. Not dramatically. Not in a way that suggested open defiance. He had been short by 2% for 4 consecutive months, always with a credible explanation. A missed pickup. A cash flow problem with one of his borrowers. A dispute with a contractor that had temporarily frozen one of his income streams. Each time, Coyle had delivered the explanation with the practiced smoothness of a man who understood that the explanation mattered as much as the money. Vincent had heard all 4 explanations. He had accepted all 4 with visible patience, while having Coyle's movements and finances quietly audited by his bookkeeper. A methodical man named Raymond who had previously worked as a forensic accountant for a regional bank before his own financial problems had brought him into Vincent's orbit. Raymond's audit had taken 3 weeks and had produced a 14-page summary that Vincent read twice on a Wednesday night in his office at Coastal Logistics. Coyle was not having cash flow problems. Coyle had been pocketing the 2% while paying his street-level collectors their full wages and maintaining all his other obligations. The 2% was pure extraction, calculated to be too small to trigger an immediate response, while large enough to compound into a meaningful sum over time. Raymond estimated that Coyle had withheld approximately $68,000 over the course of the year, including the 4 months of formal shortfalls and 8 months of similar small thefts before Coyle apparently became confident enough to begin missing the payments openly. Vincent had called Coyle to the warehouse on Dry Dock Avenue the previous evening under the pretext of reviewing shipping schedules for the winter freight rotation. Coyle arrived on time, which showed he still believed his explanations had been accepted. Vincent sat across from him at a metal folding table and placed Raymond's 14-page report between them. He did not raise his voice. He did not make threats. He explained the document and what it represented, calmly, in the same tone he might use to explain a lease renewal to a property tenant. Coyle tried 2 more explanations and then went quiet when he realized they were not going to work. He asked what Vincent wanted. Vincent told him what Vincent always told men in Coyle's position: the money, the full amount, and a demonstration that the breach had been understood. Coyle said he did not have $68,000 available. Vincent told him that was a problem Coyle would have to solve. What happened in the warehouse after that was between Vincent's 2 senior men, Paul Garrett, and a large, quiet ex-longshoreman named Terrence and Dennis Coyle. Vincent had stepped outside to make 2 phone calls and smoke a cigarette. When he came back in, the problem had been solved in the most permanent way available. He did not ask for a detailed account. He told Garrett to handle the logistics and walked back to his car. This was how Vincent Russo maintained his organization. Not through random brutality, which attracted attention and bred resentment, but through precise, proportionate responses to specific violations of specific terms. Every man who worked for him or under him understood the terms. The terms were not complicated. You paid what you owed. You did not steal from the organization. You did not create problems that required Vincent to spend time and money and exposure on solutions. If you violated these terms, the response was calibrated to the violation. A first offense involving small amounts might result in a beating and a debt that compounded at a punitive rate. A sustained and deliberate theft of the kind Coyle had attempted produced a different outcome. Vincent drove home through the pre-dawn streets of South Boston and showered and made coffee and sat at his kitchen table with the day's agenda. He was not a man who lost sleep over the things that happened in his warehouses. He had made his peace with what he was a long time ago, in circumstances that had not given him many alternative definitions of a successful life. His father, a man named Thomas Russo, had worked the same docks for 23 years, not as a manager or a crew boss, as a laborer, a man who loaded and unloaded and fixed equipment and took overtime when it was available, and still could not consistently keep the family finances above the waterline. Thomas Russo had borrowed money twice in his life. Once from a savings bank, which had worked out reasonably well. Once from a man named Eddie Caruso, who operated a loan business out of a social club on Summer Street and whose terms were manageable until they were not. Vincent had been 12 years old when his father's debt to Eddie Caruso stopped being manageable. He had been walking home from school when he heard the noise in the alley behind his building. He had gone to look because he was 12 years old and 12-year-old boys went to look at noises in alleys. He found his father on his knees in the mud and broken glass, bleeding from his ear, begging 2 men who were no older than 25 for an extension on a payment he had missed by 2 weeks. The men were not listening. They were working methodically through the process of communicating the consequence of missed payments in the only language their employer had authorized. Vincent stood at the entrance to the alley for a long moment. He was a large 12-year-old, thick in the shoulders, but he was still 12. He was old enough to understand what he was looking at, and young enough for that understanding to carve itself permanently into the architecture of how he processed the world. His father did not look at him. Whether that was to protect him from being seen, or because Thomas Russo was too ashamed to acknowledge his son's presence, Vincent had never resolved. He had turned around and walked away and gone home, and said nothing to his mother. And his father had come home 2 hours later, and said nothing to anyone. And nobody in the family had spoken about what happened in the alley for the rest of the time they were a family together. Thomas Russo died of a cardiac event 14 months later. Vincent was not a physician, and did not know whether the event had any causal relationship to what had happened in the alley. What he knew was that his father had spent his final year visibly diminished in a way that went beyond the physical damage from the beating, and that the diminishment had expressed itself most clearly in the way Thomas Russo had stopped meeting people's eyes when he talked to them. Vincent had carried the image of his father on his knees in the mud for 33 years. He had converted it into something functional, into a principle. The principle was that in any transaction between 2 parties, you were either the party with leverage or the party without it. And being the party without it was not a neutral condition. It was a condition that could end with you kneeling in a cold alley begging 25-year-olds for things they had no interest in giving you. He had organized his entire adult life around never being in that position. Every decision he had made, every risk he had taken, Every relationship he had built or declined to build had been evaluated against that single criterion. The result, after 27 years of concentrated effort, was an organization that generated approximately $22 million annually in cash flow, a network of political and law enforcement relationships that provided him with significant insulation from prosecution, and a personal reputation in the Boston underworld that ensured nobody presented him with the kind of problem that required him to go on his knees. He had also built a reputation for never extending grace on a debt. Not out of cruelty, or not only out of cruelty, but out of a conviction that mercy in financial matters was a structural weakness. Every extension you granted became a precedent. Every precedent became an expectation. Every expectation became the basis for a calculation by the next man who wanted an extension, until the entire edifice of payment discipline eroded into a system where your terms meant nothing and your leverage was theoretical at best. The men who worked for him understood this. His lieutenants enforced it. His reputation was built on it as much as on any other quality. It was this reputation, and the psychology behind it, that was going to cost him everything. He did not know that on the morning of November 3rd, drinking coffee in his kitchen and reviewing his agenda. He did not know it 4 days later, when his security team at the compound on the edge of Dorchester notified him that a woman had gotten past the outer perimeter. She had bribed one of his guards with her wedding ring. His security team told him this with some embarrassment, because it meant one of his perimeter guards had accepted a bribe, which was a disciplinary problem he would need to address separately. But the fact of her getting in was also evidence of a kind of desperation that his team considered worth reporting. Her name was Maria Delgado. She was 41 years old, dressed in clothes that had been good quality 6 months ago, and were now showing the specific deterioration that came from continuous wear and insufficient care. She had a bruise along her left cheekbone that was 3 or 4 days old, faded to yellow at the edges. She stood in the outer room of his compound's main building, flanked by 2 of his men, and she was composed in the way that people were composed when they had used up their available supply of panic and had arrived at a flat, exhausted calm on the other side. Her husband, she explained when Vincent agreed to see her, had been a regular customer of one of Vincent's lending operations. He had borrowed $45,000 2 years ago, at terms that his organization's representatives had described as manageable given the man's income from his landscaping business. The terms had been manageable until they were not, in the specific way that borrowed money at compounding rates had a tendency to become unmanageable without anyone intending it to. Her husband had died of a stroke 4 months ago. He had been 51 years old. The debt, with accumulated interest and penalties, now stood at approximately $80,000. She had received a visit 2 weeks ago from the men who managed that particular loan portfolio, and she had received the visit she described. And the bruise on her cheek was from the second visit, which had occurred 5 days ago. She was not there to dispute the debt. She understood that the debt was real and that the obligation attached to the estate and, practically speaking, to her. She was there to ask for time. She was there to explain that her husband's landscaping business had a buyer who was prepared to close within 90 days and that the sale price would cover the debt in full with something left over. She needed 90 days. She had come to Vincent personally because the men managing the portfolio had told her, in explicit terms, that the next visit would not produce just a bruise. Vincent looked at her across the desk in his main office. He looked at the bruise on her cheek and the wedding ring that was no longer on her finger, having been surrendered to his perimeter guard downstairs. He heard her explanation clearly and completely. He understood every element of it. What happened in his chest when he'd watched her ask was something he did not examine closely in the moment because he had trained himself over 33 years not to examine it. It was a pull toward something, toward the memory of someone kneeling in a cold alley, toward the 12-year-old who had stood at the entrance to that alley and watched and then turned away. The pull was strong enough that he registered it, even through the years of conditioning against exactly this kind of response. He killed it. He killed it because that was what he always did with it, and because the principle he had built his organization on did not admit exceptions, and because the moment you started making exceptions based on the emotional content of someone's appeal was the moment your operation became ungovernable. He told her no. He did it with more anger than the situation technically required, because the pull he had felt and then suppressed had produced a backlash of contempt that he directed outward. He told her that her husband had understood the terms, when he signed them, that the business of dead men did not change the terms of live debts, and that the present presentation of her circumstances as though they were his responsibility reflected a misunderstanding of what their relationship was and had always been. He told her that 90-day extensions were not a service his organization offered to people who had already missed multiple payments. He told his men to put her out. One of the men, a young captain named Gale who had been with the organization for 4 years, hesitated. The hesitation was brief, less than a second, but Vincent registered it with the precision he applied to all behavioral data about the men around him. He noted it and filed it, and said nothing about it in the moment. He told them to put her out. Into the rain, which had started 20 minutes earlier, and was the specific kind of cold November rain that made being outside feel punishing. He watched it on the security monitors. His men walked her to the outer gate and put her through it, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, getting wet, and then she pulled out a phone from her coat pocket. An older model, a prepaid unit, not the kind of phone that reflected any kind of financial stability. She made a call. She spoke for perhaps 45 seconds. Then she put the phone away and walked in the direction of the nearest transit stop. Vincent turned away from the monitors. He had a 7 o'clock dinner, meeting with his accountant, and 3 liquor licenses to sign off on before the end of the week. He put Maria Delgado in the category of resolved operational matters and moved on. He would remember the monitor image of that phone call many times over the following weeks. He would remember it the way you remember the specific moment when you made a decision that turned out to be catastrophically wrong, not because the decision was irrational given what you knew at the time, but because what you knew at the time was missing one fact that changed everything. The fact he was missing was this: Maria Delgado was not a widow scrambling to settle her late husband's debts. She was the daughter of a man named Carmen Delgado, which was a name she went by from her mother's family rather than her father's operational name, and her father was a 73-year-old semi-retired businessman named Carmen Pescator, who sat on the coordinating body that governed organized crime relationships between the major northeastern cities. The body that enforcement agencies referred to as the Commission, and that most people in Vincent's world simply called New York. Carmen Pescator had been out of active operations for 11 years. His public profile was negligible. His actual profile, to the people who understood the architecture of the northeastern underworld, was that of a man whose approval was required for any significant change in the leadership structure of any city organization in his territory, whose disapproval was final, and whose anger was something that city-level bosses went to considerable lengths to avoid. Maria had married poorly, in the family's judgment. Her husband had been a civilian, a man who ran a landscaping business, which was exactly what it appeared to be. Carmen Pescator had accepted the marriage because his daughter had loved the man and because Pescator was, in the specific way of certain men who operated in brutal systems, capable of compartmentalizing his professional detachment from his personal affections. He had kept Maria at arm's length from his business throughout her marriage, not because he didn't trust her, but because he wanted her outside the system. Being outside the system had not prevented her husband from getting into debt with Vincent Russo's lending operation. It had not prevented the visits from Vincent's collection men. It had not prevented the bruise on her cheek, and it had not prevented Maria Delgado Nede Pescator from placing a 45-second phone call to her father from the sidewalk outside Vincent's compound in the cold November rain. Vincent did not learn any of this until it was too late for the knowledge to change his circumstances. The morning of November 4th, his financial team called him at 6:15. 3 of his offshore accounts, maintained through a Gibraltar registered holding structure, had been frozen overnight. The accounts held approximately $4 million in combined liquid assets and served as the primary buffer layer between his cash-generating operations and his legitimate investment portfolio. His financial team had no explanation for the freeze and was working to contact the managing banks. He took the call in his car, driving to the waterfront, and told his team to keep working and call him back within the hour. A frozen account was not automatically a crisis. Regulatory freezes happened. Compliance reviews happened. Banks had their own risk management processes that occasionally produced temporary holds on accounts that were eventually released. It was inconvenient and would require some attention, but it was not by itself an emergency. By the time he reached the waterfront, 3 more things had happened. His legal counsel, a meticulous attorney named Francis Park who had represented Vincent's business interests for 7 years, had received a call from the U.S. Attorney's office advising that 3 of his freight shipments, currently in federal bonded warehouse storage in Boston and Newark, were being held pending a customs compliance review. The review had been initiated overnight on the basis of an anonymous tip, the contents of which the U.S. Attorney's Office declined to specify. The shipments represented about $900,000 in merchandise owned by companies nominally independent of Vincent, but connected to him through layered contractual relationships that Francis Park had constructed precisely to make that connection difficult to trace. Separate. A cargo vessel operated by a shipping company that Vincent had a silent 20% stake in had been held at the dock in Halifax by Canadian customs authorities for a secondary inspection that had no clear regulatory basis, but which the ship's captain described as thorough, systematic, and not likely to conclude quickly. And Leo Marchetti, Vincent's underboss and the person responsible for day-to-day operational management of all of his non-financial activities, had not responded to 2 calls and a text message since 6 in the morning. Vincent arrived at the waterfront office and sat down with his crew chief and his 2 remaining senior captains, men named Sal and Donahue. He laid out what he knew without editorial. 3 offshore accounts frozen, 3 shipments held, a cargo vessel detained. Leo not answering. He asked whether anyone had information about any of these events that he did not have. Sal and Donahue looked at each other. It was a brief look. Not conspiratorial, but something close to resigned. The look of men who have information they do not want to be the ones to deliver. Vincent told them to say what they knew. What they knew was incomplete and secondhand. Sal had heard from a dock contact that morning that the shipping detention in Halifax had been coordinated with the Boston Customs hold in a way that suggested a central authority was managing the process. Donahue had received a call from a captain named Richie at 5 in the morning, Richie wanting to know whether there was anything Vincent wanted the crew to do about the situation. Donahue had asked what situation, and Richie had seemed surprised that Donahue did not already know, and had described a general understanding among the crew captains that something had changed overnight in the power structure. Richie had used a specific phrase that Donahue had written down because it struck him as significant. He read the phrase from his phone. Richie had said that New York had made a call. Vincent looked at the phrase for a moment. He thought about Maria Delgado standing on the sidewalk making a phone call in the rain. He pulled out his own phone and called a contact in federal law enforcement, a supervisory agent in the Boston field office, who had been on his payroll in an informal capacity for 6 years. The call went to voicemail. He called a second contact, a Suffolk County detective who had been helpful on 3 prior occasions. That call also went to voicemail. He called a third contact, a former state trooper who had gone private and who was not formally on the payroll, but who occasionally passed information in exchange for referral fees that appeared on the books of one of Vincent's legitimate companies as consulting expenses. That call was answered, but the former trooper's voice carried the specific quality of a man who has decided that certain relationships have become too dangerous to maintain. The former trooper said he was out of town and wasn't available, and he wished Vincent luck. He said the last part quietly, with a sincerity that was more alarming than anything else he might have said, and then he disconnected. Vincent put his phone down on the desk and looked at the wall for a moment. He understood the architecture of what was happening. He did not yet understand all the specifics, but the architecture was clear enough. The frozen accounts and the held shipments were not regulatory actions. They were messages delivered through regulatory mechanisms because those mechanisms were available and because they produced concrete financial damage without requiring direct confrontation. The non-responsive contacts were telling him that his law enforcement insulation had been suspended by an authority that ranked above his ability to compensate for it. The phone call Richie had made to Donahue at 5 in the morning was telling him that the information about the change in power structure was circulating among his crew faster than it was circulating to him. The last fact was the most significant one. In an organization built on information control, the boss was supposed to know things before his crew did. When the flow reversed, it meant the crew had a source of information that bypassed him, which meant the crew had been in contact with whoever was doing this before he had been. He asked Sal and Donahue directly whether they had heard from Leo that morning. Sal said no and was telling the truth. Vincent had spent 11 years reading the behavioral signatures of men who were lying to him, and Sal's were not present. Donahue hesitated before saying no. Vincent looked at him. Donahue was a competent operational manager and a loyal lieutenant within the specific definition of loyalty that Vincent had always applied loyalty as a function of interest alignment, not personal devotion. When interest diverged, loyalty followed interest. This was not a criticism of Donahue. It was an accurate description of how these relationships worked, including Vincent's own relationships with the men above him in the chain during the years before he had been in a position to operate independently. He asked Donahue to tell him what he actually knew. Donahue told him Leo had reached out to several of the crew captains the previous evening, after 10. He had described a coming change in the organization's structure and had asked the captains to hold their positions and wait for instructions. He had not specified the nature of the change or the authority behind it. He had said that things would be clear by morning. Vincent asked whether Donahue had told Leo about this meeting. Donahue said yes. The meeting ended. Sal and Donahue left. Vincent sat alone in the waterfront office and thought about what he was looking at. Leo Marchetti had been with him for 9 years. He had been elevated to underboss 4 years ago on the basis of his operational competence and his apparent alignment with Vincent's way of running things. He was ambitious, which was not a disqualifying characteristic so long as it was channeled correctly. He was capable of independent thinking, which was an asset in an underboss as long as the independence was exercised in service of the organization's interests. What Donahue had described was not independence in service of the organization's interests. What Donahue had described was Leo Marchetti positioning himself with an outside authority in advance of that authority making a move, which meant Leo had known the move was coming before Vincent did, which meant Leo had been in contact with whoever was coordinating the pressure campaign for long enough to be read into the plan. The question this raised was whether Leo was a secondary participant in the campaign against him, or whether Leo had been a primary cause of it. Whether Leo had simply taken advantage of an opportunity presented by an outside power's grievance against Vincent, or whether Leo had gone to an outside power with information designed to create the opportunity. The distinction mattered for what happened next, but not for the immediate situation, which was the same either way. His second-in-command had turned. His cash reserves were frozen. His shipments were locked. His law enforcement contacts were unavailable. His crew captains had been told the night before to wait for Leo's instructions. He picked up his phone and called Leo. Leo answered on the second ring. The conversation was short. Leo's tone was that of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and was delivering it carefully. He told Vincent that the current situation had a straightforward resolution. Vincent needed to step back from his operational role, transfer management of his business interests, and leave Boston within 48 hours. He said there was an arrangement available that would allow Vincent to maintain a percentage of the business's income on a passive basis, and that the arrangement was fair given the circumstances. Vincent asked who was behind the circumstances. Leo said it did not matter. He said what mattered was that the circumstances were real and the arrangement he had described was the best available outcome. Vincent said he would need to think about it. Leo said he had until the following morning. Vincent ended the call and drove to his compound. He was working on very little information about the actual identity of the party coordinating the action against him, though he was beginning to form a theory. The theory centered on Maria Delgado, and the phone call she had made in the rain and the phrase Richie had used New York had made a call. Whoever was behind this had sufficient reach to freeze offshore accounts, coordinate federal customs holds in 2 jurisdictions, and flip the loyalty of enough of his crew captains overnight to make his operational position untenable. That level of reach did not come from a Boston-based competitor. Boston-based competitors had been trying to make a move against his operation for years with considerably less effect. He arrived at the compound to find that his 2 personal security guards, men who normally met his car at the gate, were not at the gate. The The gates opened as his car approached, which meant someone inside had authorized the opening, but the guards who should have been standing there were absent. He drove through the gate and parked and got out of his car. The compound was quiet in the specific way that compounds were quiet when the people in them had received information about what was about to happen. He walked to the main building's entrance, and the door opened before he reached it. Leo Marchetti stood in the doorway, in what had been, as recently as yesterday morning, Vincent's own building. Behind Leo were 6 men, all of them members of Vincent's own security apparatus, armed and not pointing weapons at him, but positioned in a way that made their availability for pointing clear. Leo said he had told Vincent the following morning, but had decided it was better to do this now. Vincent asked where they were going. Leo named a warehouse in Charlestown that Vincent had used for sensitive meetings in the past, because it was clean of electronics and had good sight lines to the street. He said a car was waiting. Vincent got in the car. The drive to Charlestown took 11 minutes. Vincent spent those 11 minutes constructing a mental inventory of his available assets. The result was not encouraging. His accounts were frozen. His physical assets, the compound, the warehouses, the business offices, were now under the control of people who were taking their instructions from Leo or from whoever Leo was taking his instructions from. His law enforcement relationships had gone dark. His loyal inner circle had shrunk, in a single morning, to approximately 0, since the only 2 people he had spoken to in the past 2 hours were Sal, whose loyalty was intact, but who was currently sitting in a waterfront office with no information and no instructions, and Francis Park, who was a lawyer and whose value to him in the current situation was limited to legal mechanisms that operated on a timeline longer than the one he was facing. The car pulled into the warehouse in Charlestown. There were already 4 vehicles parked outside, 2 of them black SUVs with New York plates. 6 men, who were not from Boston, stood outside the building's entrance. They did not look at Vincent with hostility, or with the specific focused attention of men prepared to do violence. They looked at him with professional neutrality, the way security personnel looked at a known quantity that had been evaluated and found to require management rather than force. Inside the warehouse, a single folding table had been set up under a bank of industrial lights. 2 chairs faced each other across the table. One was empty. The other was occupied. Vincent Russo stood in the doorway of the Charlestown warehouse and looked at Maria Delgado sitting at the table. She was different from the woman he had looked at across his desk 3 days ago. The bruise on her cheek was still there, still fading. But everything else had changed. She wore clean clothes. She sat straight. She had the specific stillness of a person who has spent time in rooms where the things that happen are decided, and who has learned to use stillness as a form of authority. She did not look at him with anger. She looked at him with the professional assessment she apparently had access to, now that she was not standing in his anteroom asking for grace. Leo Marchetti and the 2 men who had ridden with Vincent from the compound stood against the wall. None of them spoke. Vincent sat down in the empty chair. Maria said his name and then said 2 additional names. One was her father's name, which confirmed what Vincent had already calculated. The other was the name of the particular commission structure that her father helped govern, stated not as a threat, but as a clarification of jurisdiction. She said that she had come to his compound 3 days ago as a private individual seeking a private resolution to a private financial problem. She said that she understood his organization's lending practices, and that her husband had entered into them as an adult and had defaulted as an adult. She was not there to dispute the debt. She was there to ask for 90 days. She said that the response she received had been his prerogative, and that she was not there to tell him he had been wrong to enforce his terms. She was there to tell him what the response had cost him. She explained, in clear and specific terms, how the action against him had been coordinated. Her father had made 2 phone calls, both in the hour after she had called him from the sidewalk outside Vincent's compound. One call had gone to a financial intermediary with relationships at the Gibraltar banks, where Vincent's accounts were held. One call had gone to a federal customs official in the Northeast region who had been responsive to commission influence for many years. The customs hold had been established within an hour of the call, and the parallel hold in Halifax had been arranged through a separate contact. Leo Marchetti had been contacted at 10:45 the previous evening by a senior member of the New York organization with whom Leo had an existing relationship. Leo had been offered a specific arrangement management of the Boston operation under commission oversight, with a reduced percentage going to New York and Leo retaining the remainder. Leo had accepted. She laid this out without self-satisfaction. She was not enjoying the recitation. She was informing him of consequences. Vincent absorbed it. He had been in rooms where bad news was delivered before. He had, in other configurations, been the one delivering it. He understood the protocol. You listened completely. You showed nothing. You processed what you needed to process after the room cleared. He asked what the terms were. She said the financial holds would remain permanently. The shipments and the Halifax vessel would eventually clear through legal processes but would take months, and the legal costs would consume most of their value. His accounts would not be unfrozen. His business interests would be transferred to a management structure under Leo and commission oversight. His physical assets, the compound, the warehouses, the legitimate company offices, would be absorbed into the new structure. He asked about his personal safety. She said that was not her preference. She said her father was not in the habit of ordering the deaths of men who had not directly moved against his family's safety. He had humiliated her and thrown her into the street, which was a personal offense rather than a threat to life, and personal offenses in this context had a different scale of response than existential ones. She was not there to have him killed. She was there to tell him that he was being removed from his position and that the removal was effective immediately, and that the structure he had built over 11 years was being absorbed by a larger structure that did not need or want him in it. He asked about cash, his personal cash holdings, separate from the organizational accounts. She said what personal cash he had on his person or in his personal residence was his to keep. She said her father was a practical man who understood that removing someone's ability to eat and pay rent created unnecessary complications. He would not be permitted to rebuild. He would not be permitted to operate in any capacity in the Boston underworld or in any city under commission jurisdiction, which covered the entire Northeast corridor. Any attempt to rebuild would be interpreted as a threat to the new structure and dealt with as such. She also said that every person in the city who had worked for him or done business with him had been informed of the new structure and of his removed status. Any person who assisted him would be treated as having moved against the commission. She stood up. Vincent looked at her from across the table. He understood that he was looking at the architecture of a very precisely constructed punishment. It was not death. It was not imprisonment. It was isolation. It was the removal of every resource, every relationship, every structure on which he had built his existence for 11 years. It was the reduction of Vincent Russo to the thing he had organized his entire adult life to prevent becoming a man without leverage, without protection, without means, dependent on whatever small cash he happened to have in his pockets. He understood, sitting in that warehouse, that the punishment had been designed specifically for him. That somebody who understood him, or understood men like him, had identified the thing that would hurt most and had engineered it precisely. He had made a mistake about who Maria Delgado was, and that mistake had cost him his empire. He had made a second mistake, perhaps the more important one, in underestimating how completely he had built his power on transaction rather than loyalty, so that when the transaction structure was removed, the loyalty evaporated with it. His men had not been disloyal because they were cowards. They had been loyal to the thing he had offered them, which was money and structure and protection. When a larger version of that same offer arrived from New York, they had followed the offer. He had never given them any reason to follow anything else. He did not say any of this out loud. He sat in the warehouse while Leo and the New York security team and Maria Delgado filed out, and then one of the New York men came back in and told him it was time to go. He was put out of the warehouse on a side street in Charlestown with his coat, his personal phone, his wallet, and approximately $300 in cash. The cars drove away. It had started to rain again. He stood on the sidewalk and ran through the options available to him. The process was mechanical rather than emotional. He was not in shock. He had understood the worst case outcome since the moment he had seen the New York plates in the warehouse lot. He had simply not permitted himself to experience it as inevitable until the moment Maria Delgado stood up from the table. He called Sal. Sal answered and listened and then said, in a voice that carried genuine regret and also genuine fear, that he could not help. He said he was sorry and meant it. He disconnected. He called Frances Park. She answered. She said that she had been contacted that morning by representatives of the new ownership structure of Coastal Logistics, Harbor Properties, and Atlantic Shore Placement, and that they had served transfer documents and had requested her legal files on all three entities. She said she was, as a matter of legal ethics, still his attorney, but that she needed to inform him that any assistance she provided needed to be within the scope of legitimate legal services, and that she could not at this time advise on matters relating to his previous organizational activities. She said there was one thing she could tell him. She had spoken to Raymond, the bookkeeper, and Raymond had mentioned that he had done some quiet personal financial planning on Vincent's behalf the previous year, moving a small amount of cash into a dormant entity that was not connected to any of the three main businesses. The entity held a safety deposit box at a bank in Dorchester. She said she was not certain this fell within the scope of legitimate legal services and was not providing this as advice, but she thought he should know about it. He thanked her. She said to call if she could help with anything legitimate. He could hear in her voice that she believed the call was probably the last time they would speak, and that she wished the circumstances were different. He walked to the transit stop and took the train to Dorchester. He was aware, as he rode, that this was a mode of transportation he had not used in perhaps 6 years, and that the people on the train with him occupied a world he had long since departed, and was now re-entering through the worst possible door. The bank in Dorchester held a safety deposit box registered to a dormant holding company that Raymond had set up the previous year as a precautionary measure. Inside the box was $42,000 in cash, a prepaid phone, and a handwritten note from Raymond listing 3 addresses that were not connected to the organization. Raymond was a careful man. Vincent had recognized his carefulness and trusted it for 7 years, and the trust had been correct. He was grateful for it in a way that surprised him, since gratitude was not a response he typically had to competence. He made a mental note to find a way to compensate Raymond if he was ever in a position to do so. He took the cash and the phone and put them in his coat and left the box empty. He walked to the first of Raymond's 3 addresses, a furnished room above a laundromat on Dorchester Avenue that was rented month to month under a name not connected to him. He paid the landlord 3 months in advance from the $42,000 and went upstairs and sat on the bed. The room was clean, small, a bed, a desk, a window that looked out at a parking lot. The heating system worked. The mattress was soft enough. There was a diner 2 blocks away, which he confirmed by walking to it for lunch. He ate a sandwich and coffee and paid in cash and did not make eye contact with anyone. He was operating now purely on what he had, which was $41,000 in cash, a prepaid phone, the clothes he was wearing, and 3 years of extremely specialized knowledge about how organized crime operated in Northeast American cities, none of which was currently producing any income. He spent the first evening compiling a mental list of individuals who might be accessible to him despite Maria Delgado's decree. The Commission's prohibition on assisting him was absolute within the underworld. But the underworld did not comprise the entire universe of people who had interacted with him over 11 years. There were civilians, business owners, financial professionals, minor officials who had done legitimate business with his companies and who were not within the Commission's enforcement reach. He contacted 4 of them over the following 2 days. All 4 declined to engage, though their reasons varied. 2 cited risk and offered the specific kind of extended regret that indicated genuine fear rather than indifference. 1 was simply unable to help in any practical way, his resources and connections not mapping to Vincent's current needs. The 4th said nothing and simply did not respond to the message. The calls produced nothing concrete, but they produced data. The speed and consistency of the refusals confirmed that Maria Delgado's decree had been communicated thoroughly and efficiently, including to individuals who were adjacent to the underworld rather than in it. The new structure was not leaving gaps. He stayed in the furnished room and spent his time thinking rather than acting, because acting without better information would consume resources he could not replenish and would reveal his location and intentions to people who had every incentive to report back to the new structure. On the 4th day in the room, while he was eating breakfast from a paper bag he had bought at the diner, he turned on the small television on the desk and watched a local news segment. The segment covered a routine political story about the mayor's office. The crawl at the bottom of the screen carried a separate item about law enforcement activity at a commercial property in Charlestown. The property was one of his warehouses. The news item was brief and used the phrase ongoing investigation without specification. But the timing, 4 days after the transition, and the location, one of his warehouses in Charlestown, was consistent with one interpretation. Leo Marchetti was already having problems with the arrangement he had accepted. This was not obvious from a single news item. It might have been a routine compliance action related to the transition of ownership, or it might have been an unrelated matter. But Vincent's understanding of how these transitions worked suggested that Leo's problems, if he was having them, were likely connected to the percentage arrangement he had accepted from New York. Leo was a competent operational manager, but he was also greedy. It was a quality Vincent had identified in him 4 years ago when he elevated him to underboss, and had worked around it by ensuring that Leo's operational domain was large enough to satisfy his appetites without requiring him to extract additional value from the commission arrangement. With Vincent's structure gone and Leo operating under a commission kickback arrangement, Leo's percentage was set by New York rather than by his own ambition. That constraint would chafe. Vincent turned this over for 2 days. He was not yet in a position to act on any of it, having no resources and no allies and no clear picture of the specific details of what Leo was doing and why. But understanding what Leo might be doing was the beginning of something, and having a beginning, however small, was considerably better than having nothing. The fever started on the 6th day. He had been sleeping badly, which he attributed to the mattress and the noise from the street, and had been eating irregularly, which he attributed to the cash conservation discipline he was applying to the $41,000. He had also taken a cut on his forearm during a confrontation with a small group of street-level hustlers who had recognized him from his previous life and had decided that his reduced circumstances represented an opportunity. The confrontation had occurred in an alley near the transit stop, and he had handled it adequately given the circumstances, but had taken the cut in the process, and he had cleaned it with water and covered it with a bandage he bought at a pharmacy. But he had not sought medical attention because medical attention required an explanation he did not want to provide in a hospital emergency room. The cut had become infected. The infection progressed to fever and then to something worse, a bone, deep fatigue and confusion that he recognized, intellectually, as the progression of a serious infection, but could not address without either medical attention or access to antibiotics, neither of which he could comfortably obtain. He lay in the furnished room for 2.5 days. The experience was clarifying in the way that extreme discomfort was sometimes clarifying, in that it stripped away his ability to maintain the emotional architecture he had spent decades constructing. The architecture was designed to prevent him from feeling certain things. The fever dismantled it. He thought about his father's hands. Thomas Russo had big hands, thick-fingered from 23 years of dock labor. The skin roughened in patterns that told the story of the work without any additional narration. He had not thought about his father's hands in a very long time. He had worked to not think about them because thinking about them led to thinking about the alley, and thinking about the alley led to the specific feeling that had accompanied standing at its entrance at age 12. The helpless understanding that the world was organized in a way that punished weakness with an absolute indifference to the human cost of the punishment. He had taken that feeling and inverted it. He had used it to build something. What he had built was an organization that operated on exactly the same principle that had destroyed his father. You paid what you owed, without exception, without mercy, without any acknowledgement that the person on the other side of the debt was a human being whose circumstances might carry information that altered the moral calculation. He had become the lone shark on Summer Street. He lay on the bed in the furnished room in Dorchester and looked at the ceiling and understood this clearly for the first time, without the protection of the rationalizations that had surrounded the understanding for 11 years. The rationalizations were good ones. His terms were clearly stated. His borrowers were adults who made their own decisions. His enforcement, while harsh, was proportionate to the violation of specific agreed terms. The world he operated in had its own logic that could not be judged by the standards of a more comfortable world. All of that was true. None of it was the point. The point was that he had sat across a desk from a woman asking him for 90 days, and had felt the pull toward something human, and had killed it because killing it was what his philosophy required. And his philosophy had been built on the memory of a 12-year-old watching his father beg and finding the begging unacceptable. He had misread the alley. Or rather, he had drawn the wrong lesson from it. The lesson he had taken was that weakness was the problem. The actual problem in the alley was not his father's weakness. The actual problem was the 25-year-olds following the instructions of a man who had built an organization that did not admit mercy. He was that man. The fever broke on the third day. He ate and drank what he had in the room, and felt the clarity consolidate into something he could work with. He was not transformed by the experience. He did not experience anything he would describe as redemption. He was a 52-year-old man who had spent the majority of his adult life building and maintaining a criminal organization. And the understanding that the organization had been built on a flawed premise did not retroactively clean the history. What the understanding gave him was a different way of orienting toward what came next. What came next was not a return to power. The Commission's decision was not reversible. Carmen Pescator's reach was real, and his anger would remain active as long as Vincent was attempting to rebuild. The $41,000 was finite and would last, with discipline, perhaps 8 months. He was not at 52, going to build a second empire from a furnished room in Dorchester. What he could do, with the resources he had, was deal with Leo Marchetti. This was not a decision made in the heat of the fever. It was a decision made in the cold clarity that followed. Leo was a problem, not primarily a personal problem. Though the specific character of his betrayal, the premeditated positioning with New York, while still taking Vincent's operational decisions, the weeks or months of quiet communication with commission representatives, while Vincent was running what he believed was a functional organization that had a personal dimension, but primarily Leo was a practical problem. Vincent had learned, in fragmentary form through careful listening to street-level conversations over the preceding days, that Leo was having exactly the difficulties he had predicted. The commission's kickback arrangement was set at a percentage that reduced Leo's operational margin to something less than what Leo had apparently expected. Leo, faced with this constraint, had begun managing his cash flow in ways that were creating downstream problems. 3 of Vincent's former captains had already broken with Leo and were operating independently in reduced territories, which was creating enforcement friction. 2 of Leo's new contractors had stopped returning his calls, which suggested that Leo's reputation for financial reliability was already in question. These were the normal difficulties of a leadership transition in an underworld organization. They would typically resolve over time as the new structure consolidated. Vincent was not in a position to exploit them for personal gain. He had no organization, no resources, no leverage. He knew this. What he also knew, from a conversation fragment he had caught from 2 men talking in the diner 7 days after the transition, was that Leo was working on something that went beyond normal operational friction. The conversation had been casual, the 2 men not being particularly careful, and Vincent had been sitting 3 booths away and had heard enough to understand the general shape of what was being described. Leo was planning to resolve his commission payment problem by eliminating the person who had set the terms of the arrangement. Maria Delgado was still in Boston. She had stayed to oversee the transition personally, which was a sign of either thoroughness or of the specific kind of misplaced confidence that came from having operated for years under the protection of a very powerful man and having concluded the protection extended to every situation. She was scheduled to return to New York within the week. Leo's plan, as Vincent understood it from the overheard fragments, was to intercept her before she reached the airport. He sat with this information for a full day before deciding what to do with it. The calculation was not straightforward. Maria Delgado had dismantled his life with precision and thoroughness, and had done so in response to what he had done to her, and the balance of that particular ledger was something he could accept even if he did not enjoy it. He did not owe her a rescue. He did not, technically, owe her anything. What he understood, sitting in the furnished room with the calculation laid out, was that the calculation itself was the problem. The habit of framing everything in terms of what was owed, and what was not owed, of evaluating every situation against a ledger of obligations, was precisely what had produced the sequence of decisions that had brought him to this room. Refusing Maria's request had been a ledger decision. His father's death had been the outcome of a ledger decision, made by the men on Summer Street. The entire apparatus of his professional life had been a system for enforcing ledger logic against other people. He could choose not to make a ledger decision. He could also, he acknowledged, make a pragmatic calculation if Leo succeeded in killing Maria Delgado. The commission's response would be severe and would likely result in the elimination of everyone associated with Vincent's former organization, which would settle the question of whether he was ever going to be safe in Boston by answering it definitively in the negative. If Leo failed, or if Leo's plan was disrupted before he could execute it, the commission's response to the discovered plot would also likely clean out Leo and anyone associated with him, which had some potential benefit for Vincent's long-term survival prospects, even if it did not change his operational situation. These were the two available rational justifications. He was aware that he was reaching for them because the actual reason he was going to act was not rational, or not only rational, and 33 years of training told him not to trust motivations that weren't reducible to clear operational logic. He went anyway. He knew what he needed to find out. The logistics of Leo's plan. The timing, the location, the number of men. He spent 48 hours gathering this through street contacts, through the specific low-level information economy of the city's underworld that operated below the commission's line of sight. He spent $300 doing it, which was a significant fraction of his cash reserve. What he learned was specific enough to be useful. Leo had 6 men. 2 of them were from his original crew, veterans who understood the terrain. 4 of them were contract men hired through an intermediary, the kind of arrangement that provided deniability but also produced unpredictable quality. The planned location was the elevated section of a highway overpass on the route from Maria's hotel to the private airstrip in East Boston, where a car would be stopping her motorcade at a rigged traffic obstruction. The timing was the morning of her planned departure, 2 days out. Vincent also found, in an abandoned subway maintenance access tunnel that he had used for a hidden cache years ago, a sealed container that his security team had apparently not known about or had not bothered to retrieve during the transition. Inside was a suppressed 9mm pistol, 3 loaded magazines, and a small amount of additional cash. He was not under any illusion about what he was preparing to do. He was a 52-year-old man with a healing infected wound, operating on insufficient food and sleep, proposing to engage 6 armed men in a close-quarter situation on unfamiliar elevated terrain. He had no backup, no communication support, no exit plan beyond his own legs. In any rational military analysis of the engagement, his prospects were poor. He also had 33 years of knowledge about how his former crew operated. He knew their habits, their reflexes, their communication protocols, their tendencies under pressure. He knew that contract men hired through an intermediary were almost always less reliable than they appeared on paper, and that they predictably degraded under coordinated pressure. He knew the specific tactical errors that Leo's veterans made under stress, because he had observed them making those errors during training exercises and had noted them in the specific way he noted everything. He knew the terrain of the East Boston Highway overpass because he had used it 3 times in the past decade for his own operations. He spent the day before the planned hit walking the overpass on foot, twice, at different hours, noting the sight lines and the traffic patterns, and the positions where Leo's men would logically place themselves, given the traffic obstruction they were planning to use. He noted the positions where a single person could approach from an unexpected angle without being visible to all 6 men simultaneously. He noted the timing of the traffic light cycle at the access ramp, which was relevant to his exit options. He ate a full meal that evening at the diner and slept for 6 hours and woke at 3 in the morning and was at the overpass by 5:15 before Leo's men were in position. Maria's motorcade was scheduled for 7. He found his position in the structural shadow under the elevated section, behind a support pillar that gave him a clear angle on the traffic obstruction point while shielding him from the positions where Leo's men would be standing. He waited. The sky was overcast and it started to rain at 6:40, which was the same kind of cold November rain that had been falling when he put Maria Delgado out of his compound 17 days earlier. He stood in the rain and waited and did not think about that particular coincidence or what it meant. He thought about sight lines and timing. Leo's men arrived between 6 and 6:40. Two of the contract men took positions on the far side of the obstruction. Two took positions on the near side. The two veterans from the original crew flanked the approach to the obstruction. Leo himself was present, which Vincent had not been certain about and which complicated things. Leo was positioned approximately 30 meters back from the obstruction at an elevated point that gave him oversight of the kill zone. The motorcade arrived at 7:03. Three vehicles. The lead vehicle stopped when it reached the obstruction, which was a van positioned diagonally across the right lane. The driver of the lead vehicle assessed the obstruction and began a slowdown protocol that Vincent recognized from Maria's security team's standard approach, and in the 5 seconds of the slowdown, Leo's men moved. Vincent moved first. He came from the structural shadow behind the pillar and took one of the near side contract men by complete surprise, which was the only scenario in which the engagement was survivable. The element of surprise was real and produced exactly the paralysis he had calculated. The second near-side contract man registered what was happening and brought his weapon up. But he was doing it from a standing position facing the wrong direction, and the angle and the rain and his own surprise cost him the additional fraction of a second that mattered. Vincent was not methodical in the engagement. He was not conducting a training exercise. He operated on the specific economical violence of a man who understood that his margin for error was extremely thin, and who had constructed his entire tactical plan around making each individual moment as brief as possible before the next one arrived. He did not announce himself. He did not negotiate. He moved from position to position using the structural elements of the overpass, the way he had mapped them during his reconnaissance. And the two veterans, when they engaged him, were doing so from positions that they had chosen based on the assumption that any threat would be coming from the direction of the motorcade. He had come from behind them. Leo, from his elevated position, saw what was happening and made a series of decisions that reflected both his competence and his specific character. He did not panic. He assessed the situation and determined that the engagement had become compromised, and that his priority was to reach Maria Delgado's vehicle before his remaining men were further degraded. He came down from his elevated position and moved toward the motorcade. Vincent saw him and moved to intercept. They met in the middle of the overpass, between the disabled motorcade and the traffic obstruction, with the rain and the sound of the two remaining contract men and the New York security team engaging in the background. It was not a theatrical encounter. Leo did not deliver a speech about his reasons or his ambitions. He tried to shoot Vincent twice, and the second shot connected with Vincent's upper body and Vincent went down to one knee on the wet concrete. Leo moved past him toward the motorcade. Vincent got back up. He caught Leo 12 feet from Maria Delgado's vehicle. He came from behind and took Leo off his feet, and they went down together on the concrete, and Leo tried to bring his weapon up and could not complete the motion, and they held that position for approximately 4 seconds before it was resolved. It was resolved in Vincent's favor. He was on his back on the wet concrete of the overpass when the sirens started. He had known the sirens would come. The engagement had been loud and visible, and someone on the highway below had called it in before the first minute was over. He was aware, lying on the concrete, that the 2 rounds in his chest had connected with something significant, and that the specific warmth spreading under his coat was the kind of warmth that indicated a medical situation rather than a manageable injury. Maria Delgado stood over him. Her security team had emerged from the motorcade and had the 2 surviving contract men at gunpoint on the far side of the obstruction. She looked down at Vincent with the expression he had been unable to read 17 days ago when she had stood over him in the Charlestown warehouse. He could read it now. It was not satisfaction. It was not gratitude. It was the specific expression of a person who is calculating the weight of what has just occurred against everything that preceded it, rapidly, in real time, and is not yet certain what the result of the calculation is. He told her about Leo's plan and what he had heard in the diner and why he had come. He told her in approximately 40 words because 40 words was approximately what he had available at that moment. She listened. Her security team leader was pulling her toward the vehicle, and she was resisting the pull, standing still over Vincent, listening. She said one thing before her team moved her. She said she would handle it. He was not certain what she meant by that, and was not certain he was going to be in a position to find out. The ambulance arrived 4 minutes later. He was unconscious before it left the overpass. He woke in a hospital room with his right wrist handcuffed to the bed rail and a police officer sitting in a chair by the door. The officer was reading something on his phone and glanced up when Vincent moved and then returned to the phone. Outside the window, it was daylight, though a gray and flat daylight that did not tell him much about the time. His chest felt like something heavy was sitting on it, which he understood was the result of the 2 rounds and the surgical intervention they had required. He was alive. This was not entirely surprising given that he was in a hospital rather than a morgue. But it was information worth noting. The police officer was joined by a detective 2 hours later. The detective was a compact woman named Ciavaglia who conducted the initial interview with the specific professional competence of someone who had seen a great many complicated situations and had learned to approach them without prior conclusions. She asked him what had happened on the overpass. He told her he had witnessed a planned attack on a civilian and had intervened. He told her Leo Marchetti had been planning to murder a woman named Maria Delgado. He told her where they could find documentation of Leo's arrangement with the contract men, which had been paid through an electronic transfer that Raymond, he assumed, would be able to help trace. He told her he had been illegally dispossessed of his business assets 17 days ago, and that he would be happy to discuss the full context when his attorney was present. He did not name Maria Delgado's father. He did not name the commission. He provided exactly the information that was useful to the detective's immediate inquiry and stopped at the line where the information became useful only to larger systemic investigations that he had no interest in assisting with. Frances Park arrived 2 hours after he called her. She listened to the complete account in the hospital room and asked clear, specific questions and told him where they stood. The weapons charge was serious and could not be easily resolved, given his background and the circumstances of the engagement. The homicide of Leo Marchetti was defensible under Massachusetts self-defense law given the specifics of the encounter and the documented plan against Maria Delgado, which the detective had confirmed was corroborated by the physical evidence at the scene and the 2 surviving contract men who had, in the specific way of contract men abandoned by their employer, become immediately cooperative with investigators. The criminal exposure from his prior organization was a separate question that would require a separate conversation. He asked about his civil exposure relative to the business transfers. She said that was complex, and that the methods used to transfer his business assets were irregular and potentially legally challengeable, but that challenging them would require him to describe the full context of the transfer, which would create its own legal complications. She said it was a matter he should think carefully about. He said he understood. He was in the hospital for 9 days. On the 7th day, he received a visitor who was not Frances Park and not Detective Ciavaglia. The visitor was a woman of perhaps 50, neatly dressed, who introduced herself as an assistant to a private legal firm. She handed him a sealed envelope and told him she would wait in the corridor while he read it. The letter was from a law firm with a Providence address. It was brief and formal and explained that it represented the interests of a client who had asked to remain unnamed, but whose interests were connected to certain recent events in Boston. The letter said that the client had become aware of Vincent Russo's current legal situation and wished to communicate the following. The criminal investigation into the events on the overpass would, in the client's assessment, conclude in a manner that reflected the documented self-defense circumstances. The client had no further claims against Vincent Russo and no intention of interfering with his future activities, subject to certain understandings. The understandings were outlined in an attached document. The attached document was 1 page. It said that Vincent Russo would have no operational role in any criminal enterprise in the northeastern United States, that he would not attempt to rebuild any organizational structure, that he would live within the means available to him from his remaining personal assets and any legitimate employment he chose to pursue, that he would, in exchange, have the active protection of the client from any future adverse action by parties connected to recent Boston events. It was, stated plainly, a pardon combined with a monitoring condition. He read it twice. He called the assistant in and told her to communicate his acceptance. The weapons charge was eventually resolved to a misdemeanor, through a process that Frances Park managed with her characteristic precision. The homicide investigation was closed with a finding consistent with self-defense. 2 members of his former crew faced separate charges related to the transition, charges that Vincent had not facilitated and had no connection to. He was released from the hospital 6 weeks after the overpass. He walked with a cane. The nerve damage from one of the 2 rounds was permanent. His right leg functioned, but had a specific weakness and occasional pain that the attending physicians told him would be a long-term companion. 3 weeks after his release, Maria Delgado met him at a coffee shop in Cambridge. She came alone, or as alone as a person with her background traveled, which meant 2 security men at a table near the window. She was in the city on other business and had contacted him through Frances Park. She sat across from him, and they both ordered coffee, and she looked at him in a way that had the quality of a complete assessment of something she had been thinking about for several weeks. She told him what she had been thinking about. She said that her father's response to the incident at the compound had been calibrated to the offense, which was how he operated. She said that in retrospect, she had not expected the response to produce what it produced, which was not a humbled adversary making his way out of the city, but a man who had returned to prevent her assassination at personal cost. She said her father, when she had reported the full account, had been quiet for some time before saying that the situation was unusual, and that unusual situations required unusual responses. She said that she had recommended the response communicated in the Providence letter, and her father had agreed to it. He thanked her. She said she was not done. She said there was a second part. The second part was an offer. A shipping warehouse on the eastern edge of Boston, near the airport, legitimate business, entirely above board. That was part of her family's portfolio of legal holdings in the city. The previous manager had retired. The warehouse employed 11 people and handled commercial freight contracts with 2 airlines and 3 logistics companies. It was modestly profitable. It required someone with detailed knowledge of Boston dock operations and freight logistics. She said she was not offering it as charity, in the specific sense of something given without expectation of return. She was offering it because it was a genuine business need, and because the person who had the most appropriate combination of skills and local knowledge for the position was sitting across from her. She said she understood if he did not want to work for someone connected to the people who had dismantled his organization. She said she was asking regardless, because the situation, as she saw it, was that they had both made a very significant error in the same encounter, and that both errors had been rooted in the same assumption, that the other person's circumstances were not his or her problem. She said she thought they had both paid for that assumption adequately, and that continuing to pay for it served no purpose. He looked at her. He thought about the furnished room in Dorchester, and the fever in the alley behind his father's building, and the winter morning on the overpass. He thought about what he was now, which was a man who walked with a cane and had $41,000 minus expenses and a misdemeanor weapons conviction on his record and specific, detailed knowledge of the freight operations of the Boston waterfront and no remaining organizational connections. He said yes. He started the following Monday. The warehouse was on the edge of East Boston, within sight of the airport, and it smelled like industrial plastic sheeting and diesel and the specific cold salt air that came off the water in the morning. 11 employees. A loading dock with 3 bays. A fleet management system that was 3 versions behind current software. A scheduling process that was being managed with a combination of spreadsheets and institutional memory, both of which were inadequate. He spent the first 2 weeks learning the operation. Not directing it. Learning it. He talked to the employees, who were wary of the new manager who walked with a cane and had been introduced with no detailed employment history, and became less wary over time as it became clear that he understood freight logistics in a way that translated into practical improvements to their daily operations. He upgraded the fleet management system. He renegotiated one of the airline contracts in a way that improved the margin without creating friction. He hired a 4th bay worker, which reduced the overtime burden on the existing crew. It was, compared to what he had done for the previous 11 years, very small. He understood it was very small. He also understood that the smallness was the point, or at least was not a disqualification. He was in the warehouse on a Tuesday evening in January, 8 months after starting the job, finishing the quarterly logistics review, when one of his bay workers came to his office door with an expression that Vincent recognized as the expression of someone who had encountered a situation he was uncertain how to handle. The situation was a young man, perhaps 22, who had arrived at the warehouse after closing and had asked to speak to the manager. The young man had the specific presentation of someone who operated in the low-level street economy: the clothes, the posture, the careful evaluation of every face in the room. He told Vincent, when Vincent came out to meet him, that he was collecting a monthly fee for the warehouse's security, which was a service that had been arranged by the previous manager, and that continued under the new management. Vincent looked at him. The young man met his eyes with the practiced confidence of someone who had delivered this particular speech many times before. Vincent said there was no such arrangement. The young man said there was, and that it was $200 a month, and that it had been paid consistently for 18 months. Vincent said he was going to need the name of the person the young man reported to, and the name of the person that person reported to, and that when he had that information he was going to make some phone calls, and that after the phone calls were made the young man was going to return to his employer with a message, and the message was that the warehouse on the eastern edge of East Boston was not paying a security fee to anyone. He said this in the same tone he had used to explain ledger deficiencies to crew bosses in other warehouses in other years. The young man was not a professional. He was a freelance operator in a small extortion ring. He heard the tone and understood what it signified without understanding why a warehouse manager in a legitimate freight operation would deploy it. He said okay and left without the fee. Vincent returned to the quarterly review. He would follow up with the name and make the calls, and the situation would resolve without additional friction. He had the relationships and the reputation, separate from any organizational structure, to produce that outcome. He did not need men or money or physical infrastructure to communicate a message that specific people would find persuasive. That was simply knowledge, and knowledge persisted. He finished the review and shut off the lights in the warehouse and set the alarm and walked out into the East Boston evening. It was raining. He turned up his collar and walked to the parking lot and got into the second-hand car he had purchased with part of the $41,000 and drove toward the apartment he had rented in Somerville when the furnished room in Dorchester had become too small. He was not a powerful man. He was not a dangerous man, or not primarily dangerous. Not in the way he had been dangerous when the word dangerous came with infrastructure and reach in the specific gravity of an organization that took years to build. He was a 52-year-old man with a bad leg and a legitimate job and a working knowledge of freight logistics and a set of old relationships that still had residual value in certain contexts. He was also not in debt to anyone, not to Maria Delgado or to her father or to the organization they represented, beyond the terms of the letter from Providence, which he understood and intended to honor, not to Francis Park, whose fees were being paid from his salary in installments they had arranged, not to Sal or Donahue, or any of the men he had worked with for 11 years, who had made entirely predictable decisions when the calculation changed, and who he bore no specific grudge against. He drove home in the rain. He ate dinner and read for an hour and went to sleep at 10:30. In the morning he went back to the warehouse.